Dolph Hayliger. New York was New Amsterdam when Dolph Hayliger got himself born there, a graceless scamp, though a brave, good-natured one, and being left penniless on his father's death he was fain to take service with a doctor, while his mother kept a shop. This doctor had bought a farm on the island of Manhattoes, away out of town, where 23rd Street now runs, most likely, and, because of rumors that its tenants had noised about it, he seemed likely to enjoy the responsibilities of landholding and none of its profits. It suited Dolph's adventurous disposition that he should be deputed to investigate the reason for these rumors, and for 3 nights he kept his abode in the desolate old manor, emerging after daybreak in a lax and pallid condition, but keeping his own counsel, to the aggravation of the populace, whose ears were burning for his news. Not until long after did he tell of the solemn tread that woke him in the small hours, of his door softly opening, though he had bolted and locked it, of a portly Fleming, with curly grey hair, reservoir boots, slouched hat, trunk and doublet, who entered and sat in the armchair, watching him until the cock crew. Nor did he tell how on the 3rd night he summoned courage, hugging a Bible and a catechism to his breast for confidence, to ask the meaning of the visit, and how the Fleming arose, and drawing Dolph after him with his eyes, led him downstairs, went through the front door without unbolting it, leaving that task for the trembling yet eager youth, and how, after he had proceeded to a disused well at the bottom of the garden, he vanished from sight. Dolph brooded long upon these things and dreamed of them in bed. He alleged that it was in obedience to his dreams that he boarded a schooner bound up the Hudson, without the formality of a due to his employer, and after being spilled ashore in a gale at the foot of Storm King, he fell into the company of Anthony van der Heyden, a famous landholder and hunter, who achieved a fancy for Dolph as a lad who could shoot, fish, row, and swim, and took him home with him to Albany. The Hare had commodious quarters, good liquor, and a pretty daughter, and Dolph felt himself in paradise until led to the room he was to occupy, for one of the first things that he set eyes on in that apartment was a portrait of the very person who had kept him awake for the worst part of 3 nights at the Bowery in Manhattoes. He demanded to know whose picture it was, and learned that it was that of Kilian van der Spiegel, burgomaster and curmudgeon, who buried his money when the English seized New Amsterdam and fretted himself to death lest it should be discovered. He remembered that his mother had spoken of this Spiegel and that her father was the miser's rightful heir, and it now appeared that he was one of Haydn's forebears too. In his dream that night the Fleming stepped out of the portrait, led him, as he had done before, to the well, where he smiled and vanished. Dolph reflected, next morning, that these things had been ordered to bring together the 2 branches of the family and disclose the whereabouts of the treasure that it should inherit. So full was he of this idea that he went back to New Amsterdam by the first schooner, to the surprise of the Hare and the regret of his daughter. After the truant had been received with execrations by the doctor and with delight by his mother, who believed that spooks had run off with him, and with astonishment, as a hero of romance, by the public, he made for the haunted premises at the first opportunity and began to angle at the disused well. Presently he found his hook entangled in something at the bottom, and on lifting slowly he discovered that he had secured a fine silver porringer, with lid held down by twisted wire. It was the work of a moment to wrench off the lid, when he found the vessel to be filled with golden pieces. His fishing that day was attended with such luck as never fell to an angler before, for there were other pieces of plate down there, all engraved with the Spiegel arms and all containing treasure. By encouraging the most dreadful stories about the spot, in order to keep the people wide away from it, he accomplished the removal of his prizes bit by bit from their place of concealment to his home. His unaccounted absence in Albany and his dealings with the dead had prepared his neighbors for any change in himself or his condition, and now that he always had a bottle of schnapps for the men and a pot of tea for the women, and was good to his mother, they said that they had always known that when he changed it would be for the better, at which his old detractors lifted their eyebrows significantly, and when asked to dinner by him they always accepted. Moreover, they made merry when the day came round for his wedding with the little maid of Albany. They likewise elected him a member of the corporation, to which he bequeathed some of the Spiegel plate and often helped the other city fathers to empty the big punch bowl. Indeed, it was at one of these corporation feasts that he died of apoplexy. He was buried with honors in the yard of the Dutch church in Garden Street. The Nell at the Wedding. A young New Yorker had laid such siege to the heart of a certain belle, this was back in the Knickerbocker days when people married for love, that everybody said the banns were as good as published. But everybody did not know, for one fine morning my lady went to church with another gentleman, not her father, though old enough to be, and when the two came out they were man and wife. The elderly man was rich. After the first paroxysm of rage and disappointment had passed, the lover withdrew from the world and devoted himself to study, nor when he learned that she had become a widow with comfortable belongings derived from the estate of the late lamented, did he renew acquaintance with her, and he smiled bitterly when he heard of her second marriage to a young adventurer who led her a wretched life, but atoned for his sins, in a measure, by dying soon enough afterward to leave a part of her fortune unspent. In the lapse of time, the doubly widowed returned to New York, where she met again the lover of her youth. Mr. Ellenwood had acquired the reserve of a scholar, and had often puzzled his friends with his eccentricities, but after a few meetings with the object of his young affection he came out of his glooms, and with respectful formality laid again at her feet the heart she had trampled on 40 years before. Though both of them were well on in life, the news of their engagement made little of a sensation. The widow was still fair, the wooer was quiet, refined, and courtly, and the union of their fortunes would assure a competence for the years that might be left to them. The Church of St. Paul on Broadway was appointed for the wedding, and it was a whim of the groom that his bride should meet him there. At the appointed hour a company of the curious had assembled in the edifice, a rattle of wheels was heard, and a bevy of bridesmaids and friends in hoop, patch, velvet, silk powder, swords, and buckles walked down the aisle, but just as the bride had come within the door, out of the sunlight that streamed so brilliantly on the mounded turf and tombstones in the churchyard, the bell in the steeple gave a single boom. The bride walked to the altar, and as she took her place before it another clang resounded from the belfry. The bridegroom was not there. Again and again the brazen throat and iron tongue sent out a doleful knell, and faces grew pale and anxious, for the meaning of it could not be guessed. With eyes fixed on the marble tomb of her first husband, the woman tremblingly awaited the solution of the mystery, until the door was darkened by something that made her catch her breath, a funeral. The organ began a solemn dirge as a black-cloaked cortege came through the aisle, and it was with amazement that the bride discovered it to be formed of her oldest friends, bent, withered, paired man and woman, as in mockery, while behind, with white face, gleaming eyes, disordered hair, and halting step, came the bridegroom, in his shroud. "Come," he said, "let us be married. The coffins are ready." Then, home to the tomb. "Cruel," murmured the woman. "Now, heaven judge which of us has been cruel. 40 years ago you took away my faith, destroyed my hopes, and gave to others your youth and beauty. Our lives have nearly run their course, so I am come to wed you as with funeral rites." Then, in a softer manner, he took her hand, and said, "All is forgiven. If we cannot live together we will at least be wedded in death. Time is almost at its end. We will marry for eternity. Come." And tenderly embracing her, he led her forward. Hard as was the ordeal, confusing, frightening, humiliating, the bride came through it a better woman. "It is true," she said, "I have been vain and worldly, but now, in my age, the truest love I ever knew has come back to me. It is a holy love. I will cherish it forever." Their eyes met, and they saw each other through tears. Solemnly the clergyman read the marriage service, and when it was concluded the low threnody that had come from the organ and key with the measured clang of the bell, merged into a nobler motive, until at last the funeral measures were lost in a burst of exultant harmony. Sobs of pent feeling and sighs of relief were heard as the bridal party moved away, and when the new-made wife and husband reached the portal the bell was silent and the sun was shining.
Reustering Dirck Vandara. In the days when most of New York stood below Grand Street, a roistering fellow used to make the rounds of the taverns nightly, accompanied by a friend named Rooney. This brave drinker was Dirck Vandara, one of the last of those swag-bellied toppers that made merry with such solemnity before the English seized their unoffending town. It chanced that Dirck and his chum were out later than usual one night, and by 11 o'clock, when all good people were abed, a drizzle set in that drove the watch to sleep in doorways and left Broadway tenantless. As the two choice spirits reeled out of a hostelry near Wall Street and saw the lights go out in the taproom windows, they started uptown to their homes in Leonard Street, but hardly had they come abreast of Old St. Paul's when a strange thing stayed them. Crying was heard in the churchyard and a phosphorescent light shone among the tombs. Rooney was sober in a moment, but not so Dirck Vandara, who shouted, "Here is sport, friend Rooney. Let's climb the wall. If the dead are for a dance, we will take partners and show them how pigeons' wings are cut nowadays." "No," exclaimed the other. "Those must perish who go among the dead when they come out of their graves. I've heard that if you get into their clutches, you must stay in purgatory for 100 years, and no priest can pray you out. Bah! Old wives' tales, come on." And pulling his friend with him, they were over the fence. "Hello! What have we here?" As he spoke a haggard thing arose from behind a tombstone, a witch-like creature, with rags falling about her wasted form and hair that almost hid her face. The twain were set a-sneezing by the fumes of sulphur, and Rooney swore afterwards that there were little things at the end of the yard with grinning faces and lights on the ends of their tails. Old Hollands are heady. Dirck began to chaff the beldam on her dilapidation, but she stopped his talk by dipping something from a cauldron behind her and flinging it over both of her visitors. Whatever it was, it burned outrageously, and with a yell of pain they leapt the wall more briskly than they had jumped it the other way, and were soon in full flight. They had not gone far when the clock struck 12. "Era, there's a crowd of them coming after," panted Rooney. "Avenue Mary. I've heard that if you die with witch broth being thrown over you, you're done for in the next world, as well as this. Let us get to Father Donegan's." Wow. As he made this exclamation, the fugitives found their way opposed by a woman, who looked at them with immodest eyes and said, "Dirk Van Dara, your sire, in wig and bob, turned us Cyprians out of New York, after ducking us in the collect. But we forgive him, and to prove it we ask you to our festival." At the stroke of midnight, the street before the church had swarmed with a motley throng, that now came onward, waving torches that sparkled like stars. They formed a ring about Dirk and began to dance, and he, nothing loath, seized the nymph who had addressed him and joined in the revel. Not a soul was out or awake except themselves, and no words were said as the dance went wilder to strains of weird and unseen instruments. Now and then one would apply a torch to the person of Dirk, meanly assailing him in the rear, and the smart of the burn made him feed it the livelier. At last they turned toward the battery as by common consent, and went careering along the street in frolic fashion. Rooney, whose senses had thus far been pent in a stupor, fled with a yell of terror, and as he looked back he saw the unholy troop disappearing in the mist like a moving galaxy. Never from that night was Dirk Van Data seen or heard of more, and the publicans felt that they had less reason for living.
The party from Gibbet Island, Ellis Island, in New York Harbor, once bore the name of Gibbet Island, because pirates and mutineers were hanged there in chains. During the times when it was devoted to this fell purpose there stood in Communipaw the Wild Goose Tavern, where Dutch burghers resorted, to smoke, drink Hollands, and grow fat, wise, and sleepy in each other's company. The plague of this inn was Jan Joost Vanderskamp, a nephew of the landlord, who frequently alarmed the patrons of the house by putting powder into their pipes and attaching briars beneath their horses' tails, and who naturally turned pirate when he became older, taking with him to sea his boon companion, an ill-disposed, ill-favored blackamoor named Pluto, who had been employed about the tavern. When the landlord died, Vanderskamp possessed himself of this property, fitted it up with plunder, and at intervals he had his gang ashore, such a crew of singing, swearing, drinking, gaming devils as Communipaw had never seen the like of. Yet the residents could not summon activity enough to stop the goings-on that made the Wild Goose a disgrace to their village. The British authorities, however, caught 3 of the swashbucklers and strung them up on Gibbet Island, and things that went on badly in Communipaw after that went on with quiet and secrecy. The pirate and his henchmen were returning to the tavern one night, after a visit to a rakish-looking vessel in the offing, when a squall broke in such force as to give their skiff a leeway to the place of executions. As they rounded that lonely reef a creaking noise overhead caused Vanderskamp to look up, and he could not repress a shudder as he saw the bodies of his 3 messmates, their rags fluttering and their chains grinding in the wind. "Don't you want to see your friends?" sneered Pluto. "You, who are never afraid of living men, what do you fear from the dead?" "Nothing," answered the pirate. Then, lugging forth his bottle, he took a long pull at it, and holding it toward the dead felons, he shouted, "Here's fair weather to you, my lads in the wind, and if you should be walking the rounds tonight, come in to supper." A clatter of bones and a creak of chains sounded like a laugh. It was midnight when the boat pulled in at Communipaw, and as the storm continued Vanderskamp, drenched to the skin, made quick time to the Wild Goose. As he entered, a sound of revelry overhead smote his ear, and, being no less astonished than in need of cordials, he hastened upstairs and flung open the door. A table stood there, furnished with jugs and pipes and cans, and by light of candles that burned as blue as brimstone could be seen the 3 gallows birds from Gibbet Island, with halters on their necks, clinking their tankards together and trolling forth a drinking song. Starting back with affright as the corpses hailed him with lifted arms and turned their fishy eyes on him, Vanderskamp slipped at the door and fell headlong to the bottom of the stairs. Next morning he was found there by the neighbors, dead to a certainty, and was put away in the Dutch churchyard at Bergen on the Sunday following. As the house was rifled and deserted by its occupants, it was hinted that the Negro had betrayed his master to his fellow buccaneers, and that he, Pluto, was no other than the devil in disguise. But he was not, for his skiff was seen floating bottom up in the bay soon after, and his drowned body lodged among the rocks at the foot of the pirates' gallows. For a long time afterwards the island was regarded as a place that required purging with bell, book, and candle, for shadows were reported there and faint lights that shot into the air, and to this day, with the great immigrant station on it and crowds going and coming all the time, the battery boatmen prefer not to row around it at night. for they are likely to see the shades of the soldier and his mistress who were drowned off the place one windy night, when the girl was aiding the fellow to escape confinement in the guardhouse, to say nothing of Vanderskamp and his felons.
Miss Britain's Poker. The maids of Staten Island wrought havoc among the royal troops who were quartered among them during the Revolution. Near Quarantine, in an old house, the Austin Mansion, a soldier of King George hanged himself because a Yankee maid who lived there would not have him for a husband, nor any gentleman whose coat was of his color, and, until ghosts went out of fashion, his spirit, in somewhat heavy boots, with jingling spurs, often disturbed the nightly quiet of the place. The conduct of a damsel in the old town of Richmond was even more stern. She was the granddaughter, and a pretty one, of a farmer named Britain, but though Britain by descent and name, she was no friend of Britain's, albeit she might have had half the officers in the neighboring camp at her feet, if she had wished them there. Once, while mulling a cup of cider for her grandfather, she was interrupted by a self-invited myrmidon, who undertook, in a fashion rude and unexpected, to show the love in which he held her. Before he could kiss her, the girl drew the hot poker from the mug of drink and jabbed at the vitals of her amorous foe, burning a hole through his scarlet uniform and printing on his burly person a lasting memento of the adventure. With a howl of pain the fellow rushed away, and the privacy of the Britain family was never again invaded, at least whilst cider was being mulled.
The Devil's Stepping Stones. When the devil set a claim to the fair lands at the north of Long Island Sound, his claim was disputed by the Indians, who prepared to fight for their homes should he attempt to serve his writ of ejectment. Parley resulted in nothing, so the bad one tried force, but he was routed in open fight and found it desirable to get away from the scene of action as soon as possible. He retreated across the sound near the head of East River. The tide was out, so he stepped from island to island, without trouble, and those reefs and islands are to this day the Devil's Stepping Stones. On reaching Throg's Neck he sat down in a despairing attitude and brooded on his defeat, until, roused to a frenzy at the thought of it, he resolved to renew the war on terms advantageous entirely to himself. In that day Connecticut was free from rocks, but Long Island was covered with them, so he gathered all he could lay his hands on and tossed them at the Indians that he could see across the sound near Cold Spring until the supply had given out. The red men who last inhabited Connecticut used to show white men where the missiles landed and where the devil struck his heel into the ground as he sprang from the shore in his haste to reach Long Island. At Cold Spring other footprints and one of his toes are shown. Establishing himself at Coram, he troubled the people of the country for many years, so that between the devil on the west and the Montauks on the east they were plagued indeed, for though their guard at Watch Hill, Rhode Island, and other places often apprised them of the coming of the Montauks, they never knew which way to look for the devil.
The springs of blood and water. A great drought had fallen on Long Island, and the red men prayed for water. It is true that they could get it at Lake Ronkonkoma, but some of them were many miles from there, and, beside, they feared the spirits at that place, the girl who plied its waters in a phosphor-shining birch, seeking her recreant lover, and the powerful guardians that the Great Spirit had put in charge to keep the fish from being caught, for these fish were the souls of men, awaiting deliverance into another form. The people gathered about their villages in bands and besought the Great Spirit to give them drink. His voice was heard at last, bidding their chief to shoot an arrow into the air and to watch where it fell, for there would water gush out. The chief obeyed the deity, and as the arrow touched the earth a spring of sweet water spouted into the air. Running forward with glad cries the red men drank eagerly of the liquor, laved their faces in it, and were made strong again, and in memory of that event they called the place the Hill of God, or Manitou Hill, and Mane or Manetta Hill it is to this day. Hereabouts the Indians settled and lived in peace, thriving under the smile of their deity, making wampum for the inland tribes and waxing rich with gains from it. They made the canal from bay to sea at Canoe Place, that they might reach open water without dragging their boats across the sandbars, and in other ways they proved themselves ingenious and strong. When the English landed on the island they saw that the Indians were not a people to be trifled with, and in order to properly impress them with their superiority, they told them that John Bull desired a treaty with them. The officers got them to sit in line in front of a cannon, the nature of which instrument was unknown to them, and during the talk the gun was fired, mowing down so many of the red people that the survivors took to flight. leaving the English masters at the North Shore, for this heartless and needless massacre took place at Whale's Neck. So angry was the Great Spirit at this act of cruelty and treachery that he caused blood to ooze from the soil, as he had made water leap for his thirsting children, and never again would grass grow on the spot where the murder had been done.
The Crumbling Silver. There is a clay bank on Little Neck, Long Island, where metallic nodules are now and then exposed by rain. Rustics declare them to be silver, and account for their crumbling on the theory that the metal is under a curse. A century ago the Montics mined it, digging over enough salt to unearth these pellets now and again, and exchanging them at the nearest settlements for tobacco and rum. The seeming abundance of these lumps of silver aroused the cupidity of one gardener, a dweller in the central wilderness of the island, but none of the Indians would reveal the source of their treasure. One day Gardiner succeeded in getting an old chief so tipsy that, without realizing what he was doing, he led the white man to the clay bed and showed him the metallic spots glittering in the sun. With a cry of delight, Gardiner sprang forward and tore at the earth with his fingers, while the Indian stood by laughing at his eagerness. Presently a shade crossed the white man's face, for he thought that this vast treasure would have to be shared by others. It was too much to endure. He wanted all. He would be the richest man on earth. Stealing behind the Indian as he stood swaying and chuckling, he wrenched the hatchet from his belt and clove his skull at a blow. Then, dragging the body to a thicket and hiding it under stones and leaves, he hurried to his house for cart and pick and shovel, and returning with speed he dug out a half-ton of the silver before sunset. The cart was loaded, and he set homeward, trembling with excitement and conjuring bright visions for his future, when a wailing sound from a thicket made him halt and turn pale. Noiselessly a figure glided from the bush. It was the Indian he had killed. The form approached the treasure, flung up its arm, uttered a few guttural words, then a rising wind seemed to lift it from the ground and it drifted toward the sound, fading like a cloud as it receded. Full of misgiving, Gardiner drove to his home, and, by light of a lantern, transferred his treasure to his cellar. Was it the dullness of the candle that made the metal look so black? After a night of feverish tossing on his bed he arose and went to the cellar to gloat upon his wealth. The light of dawn fell on a heap of grey dust, a few brassy-looking particles showing here and there. The curse of the ghost had been of power and the silver was silver no more. Mineralogists say that the nodules are iron pyrites. Perhaps so, but old residents know that they used to be silver.
The Cortelyou elopement. In the Bath district of Brooklyn stands Cortelyou Manor, built 150 years ago, and a place of defense during the Revolution when the British made sallies from their camp in Flatbush and worried the neighborhood. It was in one of these forays on pigs and chickens that a gallant officer of redcoats met a pretty lass in the fields of Cortelyou. He stilled her alarm by aiding her to gather wildflowers, and it came about that the girl often went into the fields and came back with prodigious bouquets of daisies. The elder Cortelyou had no inkling of this adventure until one of his sons saw her tryst with the redcoat at a distance. Be sure the whole family joined him in remonstrance. As the girl declared that she would not forego the meetings with her lover, the father swore that she should never leave his roof again, and he tried to be as good, or bad, as his word. The damsel took her imprisonment as any girl of spirit would, but was unable to effect her escape until one evening, as she sat at her window, watching the moon go down and paint the harbor with a path of light. A tap at the pane, as of a pebble thrown against it, roused her from her reverie. It was her lover on the lawn. At her eager signal he ran forward with a light ladder, planted it against the windowsill, and in less than a minute the twain were running toward the beach, but the creak of the ladder had been heard, and grasping their muskets 2 of the men hurried out. In the track of the moon the pursuers descried a moving form, and, without waiting to challenge, they leveled the guns and fired. A woman's cry followed the report, then a dip of oars was heard that fast grew fainter until it faded from hearing. On returning to the house they found the girl's room empty, and next morning her slipper was brought in from the mud at the landing. Nobody inside of the American lines ever learned what that shot had done. But if it failed to take a life it robbed Cortelyou of his mind. He spent the rest of his days in a single room, chained to a staple in the floor, tramping around and around, muttering and gesturing, and sometimes startling the passerby as he showed his white face and ragged beard at the window. Van Wempels Goose. Allow us to introduce Nicholas Van Wempel, a Flatbush, fat, phlegmatic, rich, and henpecked. He would like to be drunk because he is henpecked, but the wife holds the purse strings and only doles out money to him when she wants groceries or he needs clothes. It was New Year's Eve, the eve of 1739, when Frau Van Wempel gave to her lord 10 English shillings and bade him hasten to Dr. Beck's for the fat goose that had been bespoken. "And mind you do not stop at the tavern," she screamed after him in her shrillest tone. But poor Nicholas, as he went waddling down the road, snapping through an ice crust at every step, a roguish wind, or perhaps it was one of the bugaboos that were known to haunt the shores of Gravesend Bay, snatched off his hat and rolled it into the very doorway of the tavern that he had been warned, under terrible penalties, to avoid. As he bent to pick it up, the door fell ajar, and a pungency of schnapps and tobacco went into his nostrils. His resolution, if he had won, vanished. He ordered 1 glass of schnapps, friends came in and treated him to another. He was bound to do as much for them. Shilling by shilling the goose money passed into the till of the landlord. Nicholas was heard to make a muttered assertion that it was his own money anyhow, and that while he lived he would be the head of his own house. Then the mutterings grew faint and merged into snores. When he awoke, it was at the low sound of voices in the next room, and drowsily turning his head he saw their 2 strangers, sailors, he thought, from their leather jackets, black beards, and the rings in their ears. What was that they said? Gold? On the marshes? At the old Flatlands tide mill? The talkers had gone before his slow and foggy brain could grasp it all, but when the idea had fairly eaten its way into his intellect, he arose with the nearest approach to alacrity that he had exhibited in years, and left the place. He crunched back to his home, and seeing nobody astir, went softly into his shed, where he secured a shovel and lantern, and thence continued with all consistent speed to the tumble-down tide mill on the marsh, a trying journey for his fat legs on a sharp night, but hope and schnapps impelled him. He reached the mill and, hastening to the cellar, began to probe in the soft, unfrozen earth. Presently his spade struck something, and he dug and dug until he had uncovered the top of a canvas bag, the sort that sailors call a round stern chest. It took all his strength to lug it out, and as he did so a seam burst, letting a shower of gold pieces over the ground. He loosed the band of his breeches, and was filling the legs thereof with coin, when a tread of feet sounded overhead and 4 men came down the stair. 2 of them he recognized as the fellows of the tavern. They saw the bag, the lantern, then Nicholas. Laden though he was with gold until he could hardly budge, these pirates, for such they were, got him upstairs, forced him to drink hot Hollands to the success of their flag, then shot him through the window into the creek. As he was about to make this unceremonious exit, he clutched something to save himself, and it proved to be a plucked goose that the pirates had stolen from a neighboring farm and were going to sup on when they had scraped their gold together. He felt the water and mud close over him. He struggled desperately. He was conscious of breathing more freely and of staggering off at a vigorous gait. Then the power of all the schnapps seemed to get into his head, and he remembered no more until he heard his wife shrilling in his ears, when he sat up and found himself in a snow bank close to his house, with a featherless goose tight in his grasp. Vrouw van Wempel cared less about the state of her spouse when she saw that he had secured the bird, and whenever he told his tale of the pirates she turned a deaf ear to him, for if he had found the gold, why did he not manage to bring home a few pieces of it? He'd answer as to how, as he had none of his own money, she could have come by the goose. He often told his tale to sympathetic ears, and would point to the old mill to prove that it was true.
The weary watcher, before the opening of the Great Bridge, sent commerce rattling up Washington Street in Brooklyn. That thoroughfare was a shaded and beautiful avenue, and among the houses that attested its respectability was one, between Tillery and Concord Streets, that was long declared to be haunted. A man and his wife dwelt there who seemed to be fondly attached to each other, and whose love should have been the stronger because of their 3 children. None grew to years. A mutual sorrow is as close a tie as a common affection. One day, while on a visit to a friend, the wife saw her husband drive by in a carriage with a showy woman beside him. She went home at once, and when the supposed recreant returned she met him with bitter reproaches. He answered never a word, but took his hat and left the house, never to be seen again in the places that had known him. The wife watched and waited, daily looking for his return, but days lengthened into weeks, months, years, and still he came not. Sometimes she lamented that she had spoken hastily and harshly, thinking that, had she known all, she might have found him blameless. There was no family to look after, no wholesome occupation that she sought, so the days went by in listening and watching, until, at last, her body and mind gave way, and the familiar sight of her face, watching from a second-floor window, was seen no longer. Her last day came. She had risen from her bed. Life and mind seemed for a moment to be restored to her, and standing where she had stood so often, her form supported by a half-closed shutter and a grasp on the sash, she looked into the street once more, sighed hopelessly, and so died. It was her shade that long watched at the windows. It was her waxen face, heavy with fatigue and pain, that was dimly seen looking over the balusters in the evening.
The Rival Fiddlers. Before Brooklyn had spread itself beyond Greenwood Cemetery, a stone could be seen in Martensis Lane, south of that burial ground, that bore a hoofmark. A Negro named Yost, in the service of the Van der something or others, was plodding home on Saturday night, his fiddle under his arm. He had been playing for a wedding in Flatbush and had been drinking schnapps until he saw stars on the ground and fences in the sky. In fact, the universe seemed so out of order that he seated himself rather heavily on this rock to think about it. The behavior of the stars in swimming and rolling struck him as especially curious, and he conceived the notion that they wanted to dance. Putting his fiddle to his chin, he began a wild jig, and though he made it up as he went along, he was conscious of doing finely, when the boom of a bell sent a shiver down his spine. It was 12 o'clock, and here he was playing a dance tune on Sunday. However, the sin of playing for 1 second on the Sabbath was as great as that of playing all day, so, as long as he was in for it, he resolved to carry the tune to the end, and he fiddled away with a reckless vehemence. Presently he became aware that the music was both wilder and sweeter than before, and that there was more of it. Not until then did he observe that a tall, thin stranger stood beside him, and that he was fiddling too, composing a second to Jost's air, as if he could read his thought before he put it into execution on the strings. Jost paused, and the stranger did likewise. "Where the devil did you come from?" asked the first. The other smiled. "And how did you come to know dat music?" Jost pursued. "Oh, I've known that tune for years," was the reply. "It's called, The Devil's Joy at Sabbath Breaking." "You're a liar," cried the Negro. The stranger bowed and burst into a roar of laughter. "A liar," repeated Jost, "for I made up dat music this very minute." "Yet you noticed that I could follow when you played." "Humph, yes, you can follow. And I can lead, too. Do you know the tune, Go to the Devil and Shake Yourself?" "Yes, but I play second to nobody." "Very well, I'll beat you at any air you try." "Done," said Jost, and then began a contest that lasted until daybreak. The stranger was an expert, but Jost seemed to be inspired, and just as the sun appeared he sounded, in broad and solemn harmonies, the hymn of Von Katz. "Now behold, at dawn of day, pious Dutchmen sing and pray." At that the stranger exclaimed, "Well, that beats the devil," and striking his foot angrily on the rock, disappeared in a flash of fire like a burst bomb. Jost was hurled 20 feet by the explosion, and lay on the ground insensible until a herdsman found him some hours later. As he suffered no harm from the contest and became a better fiddler than ever, it is supposed that the recording angel did not inscribe his feat of Sabbath breaking against him in large letters. There were a few who doubted his story, but they had nothing more to say when he showed them the hoofmark on the rock. Moreover, there are fewer fiddlers among the Negroes than there used to be, because they say that the violin is the devil's instrument.
Wyandank. From Brooklyn Heights, Orihuatonga, high place of trees, where the Canarsie Indians made Wampum suent, and where they contemplated the Great Spirit in the setting of the sun across the meeting waters, to Montauk Point, Long Island has been swept by the wars of red men, and many are the tokens of their occupancy. A number of their graves were to be seen until within 50 years, as clearly marked as when the warriors were laid there in the hope of resurrection among the happy hunting grounds that lay to the west and south. The casting of stones on the death spots or graves of some revered or beloved Indians was long continued, and was undoubtedly for the purpose of raising monuments to them, though at Monument Mountain, Massachusetts, Sacrifice Rock, between Plymouth and Sandwich, Massachusetts, and some other places the cairns merely mark a trail. Even the temporary resting place of Sachem-Pogitacut, near Sag Harbor, was kept clear of weeds and leaves by Indians who passed it in the 2 centuries that lapsed between the death of the chief and the laying of the road across it in 1846. This spot is not far from Whooping Boy's Hollow, so named because of a boy who was killed by Indians, and because the rubbing of 2 trees there in a storm gave forth a noise like crying. An older legend has it that this noise is the angry voice of the magician who tried to slay Wyandank, the Washington of the Montauks, who is buried on the east end of the island. Often he led his men into battle, sounding the war whoop, copied from the scream of the eagle, so loudly that those who heard it said that the Montauks were crying for prey. It was while killing an eagle on Block Island, that he might use the plumes for his hair, that this chief disclosed himself to the hostiles and brought on a fight in which every participant except himself was slain. He was secretly followed back to Long Island by a magician who had hopes of enlisting the evil ones of that region against him, the giants that left their tracks in Bloodstone Rock and Printed Rock, near Napeek, and such renegades as he who, having betrayed his people, was swallowed by the earth, his last agony being marked by a stamp of the foot that left its print on a slab near the Indian burial ground at Kongonok. Failing in these alliances, the wizard hid among the hollows of the moors, and there worked spells of such malice that the chief's hand lost steadiness in the hunt and his voice was seldom heard in council. When the haunt of this evil one was made known, a number of young men undertook to trap him. They went to the hills by night, and moved stealthily through the shrubbery until they were almost upon him, but his familiars had warned him of their approach, though they had wakened him only to betray him, for a cloud swept in from the sea, fell about the wretch, burst into flame, and rolled back toward the ocean, bearing him in the center of its burning folds. Because of the cry he uttered, the place long bore the name of Whooping Hollow, and it used to be said that the magician visited the scene of his ill-doing every winter, when his shrieks could be heard ringing over the hills.
Mark of the Spirit Hand. Andover, New Jersey, was quaint and quiet in the days before the Revolution. It is not a roaring metropolis, even yet, and as it offered few social advantages, there was more gathering in taprooms and more drinking of flip than there should have been. Among those who were not averse to a cheering cup were three boon companions, Bailey, Hill, and Evans, farmers of the neighborhood. They loved the tavern better than the church, and in truth the church folk did not love them well, for they were suspected of entertaining heresies of the most forbidden character. It was while they were discussing matters of belief over their glasses that one of them proposed, in a spirit of bravado, that whichever of the trio might be first to die should come back from the grave and reveal himself to the others, if he could, thus settling the question as to whether there was a future. Not long after this agreement, for consent was unanimous, Hill departed this life. His friends lamented his absence, especially at the tavern, but they anticipated no attempt on his part to express the distinguished consideration that he had felt for his old chums. Some weeks passed, yet there was no sign, and the two survivors of the party, as they jogged homeward to the house where both lived, had begun to think and speak less frequently of the absent one. But one night the household was alarmed by a terrible cry. Bailey got a light and hurried to the bedside of his friend, whom he found deathly white and holding his chest as if in pain. "He has been here," gasped Evans. "He stood here just now." "Who?" asked Bailey, a creep passing down his spine. "Hill. He stood there, where you are now, and touched me with a hand that was so cold, and Evans shivered violently. On turning back the collar of his shirt, the impression of a hand appeared on the flesh near the shoulder, a hand in white, with one finger missing. Hill had lost a finger. There was less of taverns after that night, for Evans carried the token of that ghostly visit on his person until he, too, had gone to solve the great secret.
The First Liberal Church. In 1770 the brig Hand in Hand went ashore at Good Luck, New Jersey. Among the passengers on board the vessel, that it would perhaps be wrong to call ill-fated, was John Murray, founder of Universalism in America. He had left England in despair, for his wife and children were dead, and so broken was he in his power of thought and purpose that he felt as if he should never preach again. In fact, his rescue from the wreck was passive, on his part, and he suffered himself to be carried ashore, recking little whether he reached it or no. After he had been for half an hour or so on the soil of the new country, to which he had made his entrance in so unexpected a manner, he began to feel hungry, and set off afoot along the desolate beach. He came to a cabin where an old man stood in a doorway with a basket of fish beside him. "Will you sell me a fish?" asked Murray. "No, the fish is all yours. I expected you. You do not know me. You are the man who is to tell us of God. I will never preach of him again. I built that log church yonder. Don't say that you will not preach in it. Whenever a clergyman, Presbyterian, Methodist, or Baptist, came here, I asked him to preach in my kitchen. I tried to get him to stay, but no, he always had work elsewhere. Last night I saw the brig driven on the bar, and a voice said to me, 'In that ship is the man who will teach of God, not the old God of terrors, but one of love and mercy. He has come through great sorrow to do this work. I have made ready for you. Do not go away.'" The minister felt a strange lifting in his heart. He fell on his knees before the little house and offered up a prayer. Long he stayed in that place, preaching gentle doctrines and ministering to the men and women of that lonely village, and when the fisherman apostle, Thomas Potter, died he left the church to Murray, who, in turn, bequeathed it, free, for the use of all Christian people.
The Phantom Dragoon. The height that rises a mile or so to the south of Newark, Delaware, is called Iron Hill, because it is rich in hematite ore, but about the time of General Howe's advance to the Brandywine it might well have won its name because of the panoply of war, the sullen guns, the flashing swords, and glistening bayonets, that appeared among the British tents pitched on it. After the Redcoats had established camp here, the American outposts were advanced and one of the pickets was stationed at Welsh Track Church. On his first tour of duty, the sentry was thrown into great alarm by the appearance of a figure robed from head to foot in white, that rode a horse at a charging gait within 10 feet of his face. When guard was relieved, the soldier begged that he might never be assigned to that post again. His nerves were strong in the presence of an enemy in the flesh, but an enemy out of the grave. Ugh, he would desert rather than encounter that shape again. His request was granted. The sentry who succeeded him was startled, in the small hours, by a rush of hoofs and the flash of a pallid form. He fired at it, and thought that he heard the sound of a mocking laugh come back. Every night the phantom horseman made his rounds, and several times the sentinels shot at him without effect, the white horse and white rider showing no annoyance at these assaults. When it came the turn of a skeptical and unimaginative old corporal to take the night detail, he took the liberty of assuming the responsibilities of this post himself. He looked well to the priming of his musket, and at midnight withdrew out of the moonshine and waited, with his gun resting on a fence. It was not long before the beat of hoofs was heard approaching, and in spite of himself the corporal felt a thrill along his spine as a mounted figure that might have represented death on the pale horse came into view. But he jammed his hat down, set his teeth, and sighted his flintlock with deliberation. The rider was near, when bang went the corporal's musket, and a white form was lying in the road, a horse speeding into the distance. Scrambling over the fence, the corporal, reassured, ran to the form and turned it over. A British scout, quite dead? The daring fellow, relying on the superstitious fears of the rustics in his front, had made a nightly ride as a ghost, in order to keep the American outposts from advancing, and also to guess, from elevated points, at the strength and disposition of their troops. He wore a cuirass of steel, but that did not protect his brain from the corporal's bullet.
Delaware Water Gap. The Indian name of this beautiful region, Minnesink, the water is gone, agrees with the belief of geologists that a lake once existed behind the Blue Ridge, and that it burst its way through the hills at this point. Similar results were produced by a cataclysm on the Connecticut at Mount Holyoke, on the Lehigh at Mock Chunk, and Runaway Pond, New Hampshire, got its name by a like performance. The Aborigines, whatever may be said against them, enjoyed natural beauty, and their habitations were often made in this delightful region, their councils being attended by Chief Tamanend, or Tammany, a Delaware, whose wisdom and virtues were such as to raise him to the place of patron saint of America. The notorious Tammany Society of New York is named for it. When this chief became old and feeble, his tribe abandoned him in a hut at New Britain, Pennsylvania, and there he tried to kill himself by stabbing, but failing in that, he flung burning leaves over himself, and so perished. He was buried where he died. It was a princess of his tribe that gave the name of Lover's Leap to a cliff on Mount Tammany, by leaping from it to her death, because her love for a young European was not reciprocated. There is a silver mine somewhere on the opposite mountain of Mincy, the knowledge of its location having perished with the death of a recluse, who coined the metal he took from it into valuable though illegal dollars, going townward every winter to squander his earnings. During the Revolution, Orrin the Hawk, a Tory and renegade, was vexatious to the people of Delaware Valley, and a detachment of colonial troops was sent in pursuit of him. They overtook him at the Gap and chased him up the slopes of Tammany, though he checked their progress by rolling stones among them. One rock struck a trooper, crushed him, and bore him down to the base of a cliff, his blood smearing it in his descent. But though he seemed to have eluded his pursuers, Orrin was shot in several places during his flight, and when at last he cast himself into a thicket, to rest and get breath, it was never to rise again. His bones, cracked by bullets and gnawed by beasts, were found there when the leaves fell. The Phantom Drummer, Colonel Howell of the King's troops, was a gay fellow framed to make women false, but when he met the rosy, sweet-natured daughter of Farmer Jarrett, near Valley Forge, he attempted no dalliance, for he fell too seriously in love. He might not venture into the old man's presence, for Jarrett had a son with Washington, and he hated a redcoat as he did the devil, but the young officer met the girl in secret, and they plighted troth beneath the garden trees, hidden in gray mist. As Howell bent to take his first kiss that night, a rising wind went past, bringing from afar the roll of a drum, and as they talked the drum kept drawing nearer, till it seemed at hand. The officer peered across the wall, then hurried to his mistress' side, as pale as death. The fields outside were empty of life. Louder came the rattling drum. It seemed to enter the gate, pass but a yard away, go through the wall, and die in the distance. When it ceased, Howell started as if a spell had been lifted, laxed his grip on the maiden's hand, then drew her to his breast convulsively. Ruth's terror was more vague but no less genuine than his own, and some moments passed before she could summon voice to ask him what this visitation meant. He answered, "Something is about to change my fortunes for good or ill, probably for ill. Important events in my family for the past 3 generations have been heralded by that drum, and those events were disasters oftener than benefits." Few more words passed, and with another kiss the soldier scaled the wall and galloped away, the triple beat of his charger's hoofs sounding back into the maiden's ears like drum taps. In a skirmish next day, Colonel Howell was shot. He was carried to Farmer Jarrett's house and left there, in spite of the old man's protest, for he was willing to give no shelter to his country's enemies. When Ruth saw her lover in this strait, she was like to have fallen, but when she learned that it would take but a few days of quiet and care to restore him to health, she was ready to forgive her fellow countrymen for inflicting an injury that might result in happiness for both of them. It took a great deal of teasing to overcome the scruples of the farmer, but he gruffly consented to receive the young man until his hurt should heal. Ruth attended him faithfully, and the cheerful, manly nature of the officer so won the farmer's heart that he soon forgot the color of Howell's coat. Nor was he surprised when Howell told him that he loved his daughter and asked for her hand. Indeed, it had been easy to guess their affection, and the old man declared that but for his allegiance to a tyrant he would gladly own him as a son-in-law. It was a long struggle between love and duty that ensued in Howell's breast, and love was victor. If he might marry Ruth, he would leave the army. The old man gave prompt consent, and a secret marriage was arranged. Howell had been ordered to rejoin his regiment. He could not honorably resign on the eve of an impending battle, and, even had he done so, a long delay must have preceded his release. He would marry the girl, go to the country, live there quietly until the British evacuated Philadelphia, when he would return and cast his lot with the Jarrett household. Howell donned citizen's dress, and the wedding took place in the spacious best room of the mansion. But as he slipped the ring on the finger of his bride, the roll of a drum was heard advancing up the steps into the room, then on and away until all was still again. The young colonel was pale. Ruth clung to him in terror. Clergymen and guests looked at each other in amazement. Now there were voices at the porch, the door was flung open, armed men entered, and the bridegroom was a prisoner. He was borne to his quarters, and afterward tried for desertion, for a servant in the Jarrett household, hating all English and wishing them to suffer, even at each other's hands, had betrayed the plan of his master's guest. The court-martial found him guilty and condemned him to be shot. When the execution took place, Ruth, praying and sobbing in her chamber, knew that her husband was no more. The distant sound of musketry reverberated like the roll of a drum.
The missing soldier of Valley Forge. During the dreadful winter of the American encampment at Valley Forge, 6 or 8 soldiers went out to forage for provisions. Knowing that little was to be hoped for near the camp of their starving comrades, they set off in the direction of French Creek. At this stream the party separated, and a little later 2 of the men were attacked by Tory farmers. Flying along the creek for some distance, they came to a small cave in a bluff, and one of them, a young southerner named Carrington, scrambled into it. His companion was not far behind, and was hurrying toward the cave, when he was arrested by a rumble and a crash. A block of granite, tons in weight, that had hung poised overhead, slid from its place and completely blocked the entrance. The stifled cry of despair from the living occupant of the tomb struck to his heart. He hid in a neighboring wood until the Tories had dispersed, then, returning to the cave, he strove with might and main to stir the boulder from its place, but without avail. When he reached camp, as he did next day, he told of this disaster, but the time for rescue was believed to be past, or the work was thought to be too exhausting and dangerous for a body of men who had much ado to keep life in their own weak frames. It was a double tragedy, for the young man's sweetheart never recovered from the shock that the news occasioned, and on her tomb, near Richmond, Virginia, these words are chiseled: "Died, of a broken heart, on the 1st of March, 1780, Virginia Randolph, aged 21 years, 9 days. Faithful unto death." In the summer of 1889 some workmen, blasting rock near the falls on French Creek, uncovered the long-concealed cavern and found there a skeleton with a few rags of a continental uniform. In a bottle beside it was an account, signed by Arthur L. Carrington, of the accident that had befallen him, and a letter declaring undying love for his sweetheart. He had starved to death. The bones were neatly coffined, and were sent to Richmond to be buried beside those of the faithful Miss Randolph.
The last shot at Germantown. Many are the tales of prophecy that have been preserved to us from war times. In the beginning of King Philip's War in Connecticut, in 1675, it was reported that the firing of the first gun was heard all over the state, while the drumbeats calling settlers to defense were audible 8 miles away. Braddock's defeat and the salvation of Washington were foretold by a Miami chief at a council held in Fort Pontchartrain, on Detroit River, the ambush and the slaughter having been revealed to him in a dream. The victims of that battle, too, had been apprised, For 1 or 2 nights before the disaster, a young lieutenant in Braddock's command saw his fellow officers pass through his tent, bloody and torn, and when the first gun sounded he knew that it spoke the doom of nearly all his comrades. At Killingly, Connecticut, in the autumn before the outbreak of the Revolution, a distant roar of artillery was heard for a whole day and night in the direction of Boston, mingled with a rattle of musketry, and so strong was the belief that war had begun and the British were advancing, that the Minutemen mustered to await orders. It was afterward argued that these noises came from an explosion of meteors, a shower of these missiles being then in progress, invisible, of course, in the daytime. Just after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the royal arms on the spire of the Episcopal Church at Hampton, Virginia, were struck off by lightning. Shortly before the surrender of Cornwallis, a display of northern lights was seen in New England, the rays taking the form of cannon, facing southward. In Connecticut, 64 of these guns were counted. At the Battle of Germantown, the Americans were enraged by the killing of one of their men who had gone out with a flag of truce. He was shot from the windows of Judge Chew's house, which was crowded with British soldiers, and as he fell to the lawn, dyeing the peaceful emblem with his blood, at least one of the Continentals swore that his death should be well avenged. The British reinforcements, 16,000 strong, came hurrying through the street, their officers but half-dressed, so urgent had been the summons for their aid. Except for their steady tramp, the place was silent. Doors were locked and shutters bolted, and if people were within doors, no sign of them was visible. General Agnew alone of all the troops seemed depressed and anxious. Turning to an aide as they passed the Meninist graveyard, he said, "This field is the last I shall fight on." An eerie face peered over the cemetery wall, a scarred, unshaven face framed in long hair and surmounting a body clothed in skins, with the question, "Is that the brave General Gray who beat the rebels at Paoli?" One of the soldiers, with a careless toss of the hand, seemed to indicate General Agnew. A moment later there was a report, a puff of smoke from the cemetery wall, and a bullet whizzed by the head of the general, who smiled wanly, to encourage his men. Summary execution would have been done upon the stranger had not a body of American cavalry dashed against the redcoats at that moment, and a fierce contest was begun. When the day was over, General Agnew, who had been separated from his command in the confusion of battle, came past the graves again. Tired and depressed, he drew rein for a moment to breathe the sweet air, so lately fouled with dust and smoke, and to watch the gorgeous light of sunset. Again, like a malignant genius of the place, the savage-looking stranger arose from behind the wall. A sharp report broke the quiet of evening and awoke clattering echoes from the distant houses. A horse plunged and General Agnew rolled from his saddle, dead, the last victim in the strife at Germantown.
A blow in the dark. The Tory Mannheim sits brooding in his farmhouse near Valley Forge, and his daughter, with a hectic flush on her cheek, looks out into the twilight at the falling snow. She is worn and ill. She has brought on a fever by exposure incurred that very day in a secret journey to the American camp, made to warn her lover of another attempt on the life of Washington, who must pass her father's house on his return from a distant settlement. The Tory knows nothing of this, but he starts whenever the men in the next room rattle the dice or break into a ribald song, and a frown of apprehension crosses his face as the foragers crunch by, half barefoot, through the snow. The hours go on, and the noise in the next room increases, but it hushes suddenly when a knock at the door is heard. The Tory opens it, and trembles as a tall, grave man, with the figure of an athlete, steps into the firelight and calmly removes his gloves. "I have been riding far," said he. "Can you give me some food and the chance to sleep for an hour, until the storm clears up?" Mannheim says that he can, and shuffling into the next room, he whispers, "Washington." The girl is sent out to get refreshments. It is in vain that she seeks to sign or speak to the man who sits there so calmly before the fire, for her father is never out of sight or hearing. After Washington has finished his modest repast, he asks to be left to himself for a while, but the girl is told to conduct him to the room on the left of the landing on the next floor. Her father holds the candle at the foot of the stairs until he sees his guest enter, then he bids his daughter go to her own bed, which is in the chamber on the right of the landing. There is busy whispering in the room below after that, and the dice box is shaken to see to whose lot it shall fall to steal up those stairs and stab Washington in his sleep. An hour passes and all in the house appear to be at rest, but the stairs creak slightly as Mannheim creeps upon his prey. He blows his candle out and softly enters the chamber on the left. The men, who listen in the dark at the foot of the stair, hear a moan, and the Tory hurries back with a shout of gladness, for the rebel chief is no more and Howe's reward will enrich them for life. Glasses are filled, and in the midst of the rejoicing a step is heard on the stair. Washington stands before them. In calm, deep tones he thanks the farmer for his shelter, and asks that his horse be brought to the door and his reckoning be made out. The Tory stares as one bereft. Then he rushes aloft, flings open the door of the room on the left, and gazes at the face that rests on the pillow, a pillow that is dabbled with red. The face is that of his daughter. The name of father is one that he will never hear again in this world. The candle falls from his hand, he sinks to the floor, be his sin forgiven. Outside is heard the tramp of a horse. It is that of Washington, who rides away, ignorant of the peril he has passed and the sacrifice that averted it.
The Tories' Conversion. In his fire-lit parlor, in his little house at Valley Forge, old Michael Cooch sits talking with his daughter. But though it is Christmas Eve, the talk has little cheer in it. The hours drag on until the clock strikes 12, and the old man is about to offer his evening prayer for the safety of his son, who is one of Washington's troopers, when hurried steps are heard in the snow. There is a fumbling at the latch, then the door flies open and admits a haggard, panting man who hastily closes it again, falls into a seat, and shakes from head to foot. The girl goes to him. "John," she says. But he only averts his face. "What is wrong with thee, John Blake?" asks the farmer. But he has to ask again and again ere he gets an answer. Then, in a broken voice, the trembling man confesses that he has tried to shoot Washington, but the bullet struck and killed his only attendant, a dragoon. He has come for shelter, 4 men are on his track already. "Thou knowst I am neutral in this war, John Blake," answered the farmer, "although I have a boy down yonder in the camp. It was a cowardly thing to do, and I hate you Tories that you do not fight like men, yet, since you ask me for a hiding place, you shall have it, though, mind you, 'tis more on the girl's account than yours. The men are coming. Out, this way, to the spring house." So, before old Michael has time to return to his chair, the door is again thrust open, this time by men in blue and buff. They demand the assassin, whose footsteps they have tracked there through the snow. Michael does not answer. They are about to use violence when, through the open door, comes Washington, who checks them with a word. The general bears a drooping form with a blood splash on its breast, and deposits it on the hearth as gently as a mother puts a babe into its cradle. As the firelight falls on the still face, the farmer's eyes grow round and big, then he shrieks and drops upon his knees, for it is his son who is lying there. Beside him is a pistol, it was dropped by the Tory when he entered. Grasping it eagerly, the farmer leaps to his feet. His years have fallen from him. With a tiger-like bound he gains the door, rushes to the spring house where John Blake is crouching, his eyes sunk and shining, gnawing his fingers in a craze of dismay. But though hate is swift, love is swifter, and the girl is there as soon as he. She strikes his arm aside, and the bullet he has fired lodges in the wood. He draws out his knife, and the murderer, to whom has now come the calmness of despair, kneels and offers his breast to the blade. Before he can strike, the soldiers hasten up, and seizing Blake, they drag him to the house, the little room, where all had been so peaceful but a few minutes before. The culprit is brought face to face with Washington, who asks him what harm he has ever suffered from his fellow countrymen that he should turn against them thus. Blake hangs his head and owns his willingness to die. His eyes rest on the form extended on the floor, and he shudders, but his features undergo an almost joyous change, for the figure lifts itself, and in a faint voice calls, "Father." The young man lives. With a cry of delight both father and sister raise him in their arms. "You are not yet prepared to die," says Washington to the captive. "I will put you under guard until you are wanted. Take him into custody, my dear young lady, and try to make an American of him. See, it is 1 o'clock, and this is Christmas morning. May all be happy here. Come." And beckoning to his men he rides away, though Blake and his affianced would have gone on their knees before him. Revulsion of feeling, love, thankfulness and a latent patriotism wrought a quick change in Blake. When young Cooch recovered, Blake joined his regiment, and no soldier served the flag more honorably.
Lord Percy's dream. Leaving the dissipations of the English court, Lord Percy came to America to share the fortunes of his brethren in the contest then raging on our soil. His father had charged him with the delivery of a certain package to an Indian woman, should he meet her in his rambles through the western wilds, and, without inquiring into the nature of the gift or its occasion, he accepted the trust. At the Battle of the Brandywine, strangely foretold by Quaker prophecy 40 years before, he was detailed by Cornwallis to drive the colonial troops out of a graveyard where they had entrenched themselves, and though he set upon this errand with the enthusiasm of youth, his cheek paled as he drew near the spot where the enemy was waiting. It was not that he had actual physical fear of the onset, he had dreamed a dream a few nights before, the purport of which he had hinted to his comrades, and as he rode into the clearing at the top of Osborne's Hill he drew rein and exclaimed, "My dream, yonder is the graveyard, I am fated to die there," giving a few of his effects to his brother officers, and charging one of them to take a message of love to his betrothed in England, he set his lips and rode forward, his cavalry bound toward the scene of action, and within 30 paces of the cemetery wall, when from behind it rises a battalion of men in the green uniform of the Santee Rangers and pours a withering fire into the ranks. The shock is too great to withstand, and the redcoats stagger away with broken ranks, leaving many dead and wounded on the ground. Lord Percy is the coolest of all. He urges the broken columns forward, and almost alone holds the place until the infantry, 100 yards behind, come up. Thereupon ensues one of those hand-to-hand encounters that are so rare in recent war, and that are the sorest test of valor and discipline. Now rides forward Captain Waldemar, chief of the Rangers and a half-breed Indian, who, seeing Percy, recognizes him as an officer and engages him in combat. There's for a minute a clash of steel on steel, then the nobleman falls heavily to the earth, dead. His dream has come true. At night the Captain Waldemar seeks out the body of this officer, attracted by something in the memory of his look, and from his bosom takes a packet that was committed to his care. By lantern light he reads, carelessly at first, then rapidly and eagerly, and at the close he looks long and earnestly at the dead man, and seems to brush away a tear. Strange thing to do over the body of an enemy. Why had fate decreed that they should be enemies? For Waldemar is the half-brother of Percy. His mother was the Indian girl that the Earl, now passing his last days in England, had deceived with a pretended marriage, and the letters promise patronage to her son. The half-breed digs a grave that night with his own hands and lays the form of his brother in it.
Saved by the Bible. It was on the day after the Battle of Germantown that Warner, who wore the blue, met his hated neighbor, the Tory Dabney, near that bloody field. By a common impulse the men fell upon each other with their knives, and Warner soon had his enemy in a position to give him the death stroke, but Dabney began to bellow for quarter. "My brother cried for quarter at Paoli," answered the other, "and you struck him to the heart. I have a wife and child. Spare me for their sakes." My brother had a wife and 2 children. Perhaps you would like to beg your life of them. Though made in mockery, this proposition was caught at so earnestly that Warner at length consented to take his adversary, firmly bound, to the house where the bereaved family was living. The widow was reading the Bible to her children, but her grief was too fresh to gather comfort from it. When Dabney was flung into the room he grovelled at her feet and begged piteously for mercy. Her face did not soften, but there was a kind of contempt in the settled sadness of her tone as she said, "It shall be as God directs. I will close this Bible, open it at chance, and when this boy shall put his finger at random on a line, by that you must live or die." The book was opened, and the child put his finger on a line. "That man shall die." Warner drew his knife and motioned his prisoner to the door. He was going to lead him into the wood to offer him as a sacrifice to his brother's spirit. "No, no!" shrieked the wretch. "Give me one more chance, one more. Let the girl open the book." The woman coldly consents, and when the book is opened for the second time she reads, "Love your enemies." There are no other words. The knife is used, but it is to cut the prisoner's bonds, and he walks away with head hung down, never more to take arms against his countrymen. And glad are they all at this, when the husband is brought home, not dead, though left among the corpses at Paoli, but alive and certain of recovery, with such nursing as his wife will give him. After tears of joy have been shed she tells him the story of the Bible judgment, and all the members of the family fall on their knees in thanksgiving that the blood of Dabney is not upon their heads. Parasite of the Wissahickon. Farmer Derwin and his 4 stout sons set off on an autumn night for the meeting of patriots at a house on the Wissahickon. A meeting that bodes no good to the British encamped in Philadelphia. Let the redcoats laugh as they will at the ragtag and bobtail, and are joining the army of Mr. Washington in the wilds of the Skipack. The farmer sighs as he thinks that his younger son alone should be missing from the company, and wonders for the 1000th time what has become of the boy. They sit by a rock that juts into the road to trim their lantern, and while they talk together they are startled by an exclamation. It is from Ellen, the adopted daughter of Derwin and the betrothed of his missing son. On the night that the boy stole away from his father's house, he asked her to meet him in this place in a year's time, and the year is up tonight. But is not to meet him that she is hastening now. She has heard that the British have learned of the Patriot gathering and will try to make prisoners of the company. Even as she tells of this, there is a sound to the southward. The column is on the march. The farmer's eye blazes with rage and hate. Boys, he says, yonder come those who intend to kill us. Let them taste of their own warfare. Stand here in the shadow and fire as they pass this rock. The troopers ride on, chuckling over their sure success, when there is a report of rifles and 4 of the redcoats are in the dust. The survivors, though taken by surprise, prove their courage by halting to answer the volley, and one of them springs from his saddle, seizes Derwent, and plunges a knife into his throat. The rebel falls. His blood pools around him. The British are successful, for 2 of the young men are bound and 2 of them have fallen, and there is a cheer of victory, but the trooper with the knife in his hand does not raise his voice. He bends above the farmer as still as one dead, until his captain claps him on the shoulder. As he rises, the prisoners start in wonder, for the face they see in the lantern light is that of their brother, yet strange in its haggardness and its smear of blood on the cheek. The girl runs from her hiding place with a cry, but stands in horror when her foot touches the gory pool in the road. The trooper opens his coat and offers her a locket. It contains her picture, and he has worn it above his heart for a year, but she lets it fall and sinks down, moaning. The soldier tears off his red coat, tramples it in the dust, then vaulting to his saddle he plunges into the river, fords it, and crashes through the underbrush on the other side. In a few minutes he has reached the summit of a rock that rises nearly 100 feet above the stream. The horse halts at the edge, but on a fierce stab of the spur into his flank he takes the leap. With a despairing yell the traitor and parricide goes into eternity.
The blacksmith at Brandywine. Terrible in the field at Brandywine was the figure of a man armed only with a hammer, who plunged into the ranks of the enemy, heedless of his own life, yet seeming to escape their shots and saber cuts by magic, and with Thor strokes beat them to the earth. But yesterday war had been to him a distant rumor, a thing as far from his cottage at Dilworth as if it had been in Europe, but he had revolted at a plot that he had overheard to capture Washington and had warned the general. In revenge the Tories had burned his cottage, and his wife and baby had perished in the flames. All day he had sat beside the smoking ruins, unable to weep, unable to think, unable almost to suffer, except dumbly, for as yet he could not understand it. But when the drums were heard they roused the tiger in him, and gaunt with sleeplessness and hunger he joined his countrymen and ranged like Ajax on the field. Every cry for quarter was in vain. To every such appeal he had but one reply, his wife's name, Mary. Near the end of the fight he lay beside the road, his leg broken, his flesh torn, his life ebbing from a dozen wounds. A wagoner, hasting to join the American retreat, paused to give him drink. "I've only 5 minutes more of life in me," said the smith. "Can you lift me into that tree and put a rifle in my hands?" The powerful teamster raised him to the crotch of an oak, and gave him the rifle and ammunition that a dying soldier had dropped there. A band of redcoats came running down the road, chasing some farmers. The blacksmith took careful aim. There was a report, and the leader of the band fell dead. A pause. Again a report rang out, and a trooper sprawled upon the ground. The marksman had been seen, and a lieutenant was urging his men to hurry on and cut him down. There was a third report, and the lieutenant reeled forward into the road, bleeding and cursing. "That's for Mary," gasped the blacksmith. The rifle dropped from his hands, and he, too, sank lifeless against the boughs.
Father and son, it was 3 soldiers, escaping from the rout of Braddock's forces, who caught the alleged betrayer of their general and put him to the death. They threw his purse of ill-gotten Louis d'Or into the river, and sent him swinging from the edge of a ravine, with a vine about his neck and a placard on his breast. And so they left him. 20 years pass, and the war fires burn more fiercely in the vales of Pennsylvania, but, too old to fight, the schoolmaster sits at his door near Chad's Ford and smokes and broods upon the past. He thinks of the time when he marched with Washington, when with 2 wounded comrades he returned along the lonely trail. Then comes the vision of a blackening face, and he rises and wipes his brow. "It was right," he mutters. "He sent 1,000 of his brothers to their deaths." Gilbert Gates comes that evening to see the old man's daughter. A smooth, polite young fellow, but Mayland cannot like him, and after some short talk he leaves him, pleading years in rheumatism, and goes to bed. But not to sleep, for toward 10 o'clock his daughter goes to him and urges him to fly, for men are gathering near the house, Tories, she is sure, and they mean no good. Laughing at her fears, but willing to relieve her anxiety, the old man slips into his clothes, goes into the cellar, and then starts for the barn, while the girl remains for a few minutes to hide the silver. He does not go far before Gates is at his elbow with the whispered words, "Into the stack quick. They are after you." Mayland hesitates with distrust, but the appearance of men with torches leaves no time for talk. With Gilbert's help he crawls deep into the straw and is covered up. Presently a rough voice asks which way he has gone. Gilbert replies that he has gone to the wood, but there is no need for getting into a passion, and that on no account would it be advisable to fire the stack. "Won't we though?" cries one of the party. "We'll burn the rebel out of house and home," and thrusting his torch into the straw it is ablaze in an instant. The crowd hurries away toward the wood, and does not hear the stifled groan that comes out of the middle of the fire. Gates takes a paper from his pocket, and, after reading it for the last time, flings it upon the flame. It bears the inscription, "Isaac Gates, traitor and spy, hung by 3 soldiers of His Majesty's army." Isaac Mayland. From his moody contemplation he rouses with a start, for Mayland's daughter is there. Her eyes are bent on a distorted thing that lies among the embers, and in the dying light of the flames it seems to move. She studies it close, then with a cry of pain and terror she falls upon the hot earth, and her senses go out, not to be regained in waffle years. With head low bowed, Gilbert Gates trudges away. In the fight at Brandywine next day, Black Samson, a giant Negro, armed with a scythe, sweeps his way through the red ranks like a sable figure of time. Mayland had taught him, his daughter had given him food. It is to avenge them that he is fighting. In the height of the conflict he enters the American ranks leading a prisoner, Gilbert Gates. The young man is pale, stern, and silent. His deed is known, he is a spy as well as a traitor, but he asks no mercy. It is rumored that next day he alone, of the prisoners, was led to a wood and lashed by arms and legs to a couple of hickory trees that had been bent by a prodigious effort and tied together by their tops. The lashing was cut by a rifle ball, the trees regained their straight position with a snap like whips, and that was the way Gilbert Gates came to his end.
The envy of Manhattoes. Behind the mountains that gloom about the romantic village of Mauch-Chunk, Pennsylvania, was once a lake of clear, bright water, its winding loops and bays extending back for several miles. On one of its prettiest bits of shore stood a village of the Lenni Lenape, and largest of its wigwams, most richly pictured without, most luxurious in its couching of furs within, was that of the young chief, Wanogo. This Indian was a man of great size, strength, and daring. Single-handed he had slain the bear on Mauch-Chunk, Bear Mountain, and it was no wonder that Winona, the fairest of her tribe, was flattered when he sued for her hand, and promptly consented to be his wife. It was Wanogo's fortune in war, the chase, and love that roused the envy of Manhattoes. One day, as the couple were floating in their shallop of bark on the calm lake, idly enjoying the sunshine and saying pretty things to each other, the Manhattoes rose among the mountains. Terrible was his aspect, for the scowl of hatred was on his face, thunder crashed about his head, and fire snapped from his eyes. Covering his right hand with his invincible magic mitten, he dealt a blow on the hills that made the earth shake, and rived them to a depth of 1,000 feet. Through the chasm thus created the lake poured a foaming deluge, and borne with it was the canoe of Wanogo and Winona. One glance at the wrathful face in the clouds above them and they knew that escape was hopeless, so, clasping each other in a close embrace, they were whirled away to death. Manhattoes strode away moodily among the hills, and ever since that time the Lehigh has rolled through the chasm that he made. The memory of Wanogo is preserved in the name of a glen and cascade a short distance above Mauch-Chunk. It is not well to be too happy in this world. It rouses the envy of the gods.
The last revel in Prince Hall. Young man, I'll give thee $5 a week to be caretaker in Prince Hall, said Quaker Keith to Fiddler Matthews, on an autumn evening. Young Matthews had just been taunting the old gentleman with being afraid to sleep on his own domain, and as the eyes of all the tavern loungers were on him he could hardly decline so flattering a proposition, so, after some hemming and hawing, he said he would take the Quaker at his word. He played but 2 or 3 more tunes that evening, did Peter Matthews, and played them rather sadly. Then, as Keith had finished his mulled cider and departed, he took his homeward way in thoughtful mood. Prince Hall stood in a lonely, weed-grown garden near Chester, Pennsylvania, and thither repaired Peter, as next day's twilight shut down, with a mattress, blanket, comestibles, his beloved fiddle, and a flask of whiskey. Ensconcing himself in the room that was least depressing in appearance, he stuffed rags into the vacant panes, lighted a candle, started a blaze in the fireplace, and ate his supper. "Not so bad a place, after all," mumbled Peter, as he warmed himself at the fire and the flask. Then, taking out his violin, he began to play. The echo of his music emphasized the emptiness of the house. The damp got into the strings so that they sounded tubby, and there were unintentional quavers in the melody whenever the trees swung against the windows and splashed them with rain, or when a distant shutter fell a creaking. Finally, he stirred the fire, bolted the door, snuffed his candle, took a courageous pull at the liquor, flung off his coat and shoes, rolled his blanket around him, stretched himself on the mattress, and fell asleep. He was awakened by, well, he could not say what, exactly, only he became suddenly as wide awake as ever he had been in his life, and listened for some sound that he knew was going to come out of the roar of the wind and the slamming, grating, and whistling about the house. Yes, there it was, a tread and a clank on the stair. The door, so tightly bolted, flew open, and there entered a dark figure with steeple-crown hat, cloak, jack boots, sword, and corselet. The terrified fiddler wanted to howl, but his voice was gone. "I am Peter Prince, Governor-General of His Swedish Majesty's American colonies, and builder of this house," said the figure. "'Tis the night of the autumnal equinox, when my friends meet here for revel. Take thy fiddle and come. Play, but speak not." And whether he wished or no, Peter was drawn to follow the figure, which he could make out by the phosphor gleam of it. Downstairs they went, doors swinging open before them, and along corridors that clanged to the stroke of the specter's boot heels. Now they came to the ancient reception room, and as they entered it Peter was dazzled. The floor was smooth with wax, logs snapped in the fireplace, though the flame was somewhat blue. The old hangings and portraits looked fresh, and in the light of wax candles 100 people, in the brave array of old times, walked, courtesied, and seemed to laugh and talk together. As the fiddler appeared, every eye was turned on him in a disquieting way, and when he addressed himself to his bottle, from every throat came a hollow laugh. Finding his way to a chair he sank into it and put his instrument in position. At the first note the couples took hands, and as he struck into a jig they began to circle swiftly, leaping wondrous high. Faster went the music, for the whiskey was at work in Peter's noddle, and wilder grew the dance. It was as if the storm had come in through the windows and was blowing these people hither and yon, around and around. The fiddler vaguely wondered at himself, for he had never played so well, though he had never heard the tune before. Now loomed Governor Prince in the middle of the room, and extending his hand he ordered the dance to cease. "Thou bast played well, fiddler," he said, "and shalt be paid." Then, at his signal, came 2 Negro men tugging at a strong box that Prince unlocked. It was filled with gold pieces. "Hold thy fiddle bag," commanded the governor, and Peter did so, watching, open-mouthed, the transfer of a double handful of treasure from box to sack. Another such handful followed, and another. At the 4th Peter could no longer contain himself. He forgot the injunction not to speak, and shouted gleefully, "Lord Harry! Here's luck!" There was a shriek of demon laughter, the scene was lost in darkness, and Peter fell insensible. In the morning a tavern-haunting friend, anxious to know if Peter had met with any adventure, entered the house and went cautiously from room to room, calling on the watcher to show himself. There was no response. At last he stumbled on the whiskey bottle, empty, and knew that Peter must be near. Sure enough, there he lay in the great room, with dust and mold thick on everything, and his fiddle smashed into 1,000 pieces. Peter, on being awakened, looked ruefully about him, then sprang up and eagerly demanded his money. "What money?" asked his friend. The fiddler clutched at his green bag, opened it, shook it. There was nothing. Nor was there any delay in Peter's exit from that mansion, and when, 24 hours after, the house went up in flames, he averred that the ghosts had set it afire, and that he knew where they brought their coals from.
The 2 rings. Gabrielle de Saint Pierre, daughter of the commandant of Fort Le Boeuf, now Waterford, Pennsylvania, that the French had set up on the Ohio River, was Parisian by birth and training, but American by choice. for she had enjoyed on this lonesome frontier a freedom equal to that of the big-handed, red-faced half-breeds, and she was as wild as an Indian in her sports. Returning from a hunt, one day, she saw 3 men advancing along the trail, and, as it was easy to see that they were not Frenchmen, her guide slipped an arrow to the cord and discharged it, but Gabrielle was as quick as he, for she struck the missile as it was leaving the bow and it quivered harmlessly into a beach. The younger of the men who were advancing, he was Harry Fairfax, of Virginia, said to his chief, "Another escape for you, George." Heaven sent one of its angels to avert that stroke. Washington, for it was he, answered lightly, and, as no other hostile demonstrations were made, the newcomers pressed onto the fort, where St. Pierre received them cordially. Though he knew that their errand was to claim his land on behalf of the English and urge the French to retire to the southwest. The days that were spent in futile negotiation passed all too swiftly for Fairfax, for he had fallen in love with Gabrielle. She would not consent to a betrothal until time had tried his affection, but as a token of friendship she gave him a stone circlet of Indian manufacture, and received in exchange a ring that had been worn by the mother of Fairfax. After the diplomats had returned, the English resolved to enforce their demand with arms, and Fairfax was one of the first to be dispatched to the front. Early in the campaign his company engaged the enemy near the Ohio River, and in the heat of battle he had time to note and wonder at the strange conduct of one of the French officers, a mere stripling, who seemed more concerned to check the fire of his men than to secure any advantage in the fight. Presently the French gave way, and with a cheer the English ran forward to claim the field, the ruder spirits among them at once beginning to plunder the wounded. A cry for quarter drew Fairfax with a bound to the place whence it came, and dashing aside a pilfering soldier, he bent above a slight form that lay extended on the earth, the young officer whose strange conduct had so surprised him. In another moment he recognized his mother's ring on one of the slender hands. It was Gabrielle. Her father had perished in the fight, but she had saved her lover. In due time she went with her affianced to his home in Williamsburg, Virginia, and became mistress of the Fairfax mansion. But she never liked the English as a people, and when, in later years, 2 sturdy sons of hers asked leave to join the Continental Army, she readily consented.
Flame scalps of the Chartiers. Before Pittsburgh had become worthy to be called a settlement, a white man rowed his boat to the mouth of Chartiers Creek, near that present city. He was seeking a place in which to make his home, and a little way upstream, where were timber, water, and a southern slope, he marked a tomahawk claim, and set about clearing the land. Next year his wife, 2 children, and his brother came to occupy the cabin he had built, and for a long time all went happily. But on returning from a long hunt the brothers found the little house in ashes and the charred remains of its occupants in the ruins. Though nearly crazed by this catastrophe they knew that their own lives were in hourly peril, and they wished to live until they could punish the savages for this crime. After burying the bodies, they started east across the hills, leaving a letter on birch bark and a cleft stick at the mouth of Chartiers Creek, in which the tragedy was recounted. This letter was afterward found by trappers. The men themselves were never heard from, and it is believed that they, too, fell at the hands of the Indians. Old settlers used to affirm that on summer nights the cries of the murdered innocents could be heard in the little valley where the cabin stood, and when storms were coming up these cries were often blended with the yells of savages. More impressive are the deathlights, the will-o'-the-wisps, that wander over the scene of the tragedy, and up and down the neighboring slopes. These apparitions are said to be the spirits of husband and wife seeking each other, or going together in search of their children. But some declare that in their upward streaming rays it can readily be seen that they are the scalps of the slain. 2 of them have a golden hue, and these are the scalps of the children. From beneath them drops of red seem to distill on the grass and are found to have bedewed the flowers on the following morning.
The consecration of Washington. In 1773 some of the Pietist monks were still living in their rude monastery whose ruins are visible on the banks of the Wissahickon. Chief among these mystics was an old man who might have enjoyed the wealth and distinction warranted by a title had he chosen to remain in Germany, but he had forsworn vanities, and had come to the New World to pray, to rear his children, and to live a simple life. Some said he was an alchemist, and many believed him to be a prophet. The infrequent wanderer beside the romantic river had seen lights burning in the window of his cell and had heard the solemn sound of song and prayer. On a winter night, when snow lay untrodden about the building and a sharp air stirred in the trees with a sound like harps, the old man sat in a large room of the place, with his son and daughter, waiting. For a prophecy had run that on that night, at the 3rd hour of morning, the deliverer would present himself. In a dream was heard a voice, saying, "I will send a deliverer to the New World who shall save my people from bondage, as my son saved them from spiritual death." The night wore on in prayer and meditation, and the hours tolled heavily across the frozen wilderness, But, at the stroke of 3, steps were heard in the snow and the door swung open. The man who entered was of great stature, with a calm, strong face, a powerful frame, and a manner of dignity and grace. "Friends, I have lost my way," said he. "Can you direct me?" The old man started up in a kind of rapture. "You have not lost your way," he cried, "but found it. You are called to a great mission. Kneel at this altar and receive it." The stranger looked at the man in surprise and a doubt passed over his face. "Nay, I am not mad," urged the recluse, with a slight smile. "Listen. Tonight, disturbed for the future of your country, and unable to sleep, you mounted horse and rode into the night air to think on the question that cannot be kept out of your mind: is it lawful for the subject to draw sword against his king? The horse wandered, you knew and cared not whither, until he brought you here." "How do you know this?" asked the stranger, in amazement. "Be not surprised, but kneel while I anoint thee deliverer of this land." Moved and impressed, the man bowed his knee before one of his fellows for the first time in his life. The monk touched his finger with oil, and laying it on the brow of the stranger said, "Do you promise, when the hour shall strike, to take the sword in defense of your country? Do you promise, when you shall see your soldiers suffer for bread and fire, and when the people you have led to victory shall bow before you, to remember that you are but the minister of God in the work of a nation's freedom?" With a new light burning in his eyes, the stranger bent his head. "Then, in his name, I consecrate thee deliverer of this oppressed people. When the time comes, go forth to victory, for, as you are faithful, be sure that God will grant it. Wear no crown, but the blessings and honor of a free people, save this." As he finished, his daughter, a girl of 17, came forward and put a wreath of laurel on the brow of the kneeling man. "Rise," continued the prophet, "and take my hand, which I have never before offered to any man, and accept my promise to be faithful to you and to this country, even if it cost my life." As he arose, the son of the priest stepped to him and girt a sword upon his hip, and the old man held up his hands in solemn benediction. The stranger laid his hand on the book that stood open on the altar and kissed the hilt of his sword. "I will keep the faith," said he. At dawn he went his way again, and no one knew his name, but when the fires of battle lighted the western world, America looked to him for its deliverance from tyranny. Years later it was this spot that he revisited, alone, to pray, and here Sir William Howe offered to him, in the name of his king, the title of Regent of America. He took the parchment and ground it into a rag in the earth at his feet. For this was Washington. Marion, blooming and maidenly, though she dressed in leather and used a rifle like a man, was Marion, granddaughter of old Abraham, who counted his years as 90, and who for many of those years had lived with his books in the tidy cabin where the Youghiogheny and Monongahela come together. This place stood near the trail along which Braddock marched to his defeat, and it was one of the stragglers from this command, a bony half-breed with red hair, called Red Wolf, that knocked at the door and asked for water. Seeing no one but Marion he ventured in, and would have tried not only to make free with the contents of the little house but would have kissed the girl as well, only that she seized her rifle and held him at bay. Still, the fellow would have braved a shot, had not a young officer in a silver-laced uniform glanced through the open door in passing and discovered the situation. He doffed his chapeau to Marion, then said sternly to the rogue, "Retire. Your men are waiting for you." Red Wolf slunk away, and Washington, for it was he, begged that he might rest for a little time under the roof. This request was gladly complied with, both by the girl and by her grandfather, who presently appeared, and the fever that threatened the young soldier was averted by a day of careful nursing. Marion's innate refinement, her gentleness, her vivacity, could not fail to interest Washington, and the vision of her face was with him for many a day. He promised to return, then he rode forward and caught up with the troops. He survived the battle in which 700 of his comrades were shot or tomahawked and scalped. One Indian fired at him 11 times, and 5 of the bullets scratched him. After that the savage forbore, believing that the officer was under Manhattoes' protection. When the retreating column approached the place where Marion lived, he hastened on in advance to see her. The cabin was in ashes. He called, but there was no answer. When he turned away, with sad and thoughtful mien, a brown tress was wrapped around his finger, and in his cabinet he kept it until his death, folded in a paper marked, Marion, July 11, 1755.
Evangeline. The seizure by England of the country that soon afterward was rechristened Nova Scotia was one of the cruelest events in history. The land was occupied by a good and happy people who had much faith and few laws, plenty to eat and drink, no tax collectors nor magistrates in brief, a people who were entitled to call themselves Acadians, for they made their land an Arcady. Upon them swooped the British ships, took them unarmed and unoffending, crowded them aboard their transports, often separating husband and wife, parents and children, scattered them far and wide, beyond hope of return, and set up the cross of St. George on the ruins of prosperity and peace. On the shore of the basin of Minas can still be traced the foundations of many homes that were perforce deserted at that time, and among them are the ruins of Grand Prix. Here lived Evangeline Bellefontaine and Gabriel Lajeunesse, who were betrothed with the usual rejoicings just before the coming of the English. They had expected, when their people were arrested, to be sent away together, but most of the men were kept under guard, and Gabriel was at sea, bound neither he nor she knew whither. When Evangeline found herself in her father's house alone, for grief and excitement had been more than her aged parent could bear, and he was buried at the shore just before the women of the place were crowded on board of a transport. As the ship set off, her sorrowing passengers looked behind them to see their homes going up in flame and smoke, and Acadia knew them no more. The English had planned well to keep these people from coming together for conspiracy or revenge. They scattered them over all America, from Newfoundland to the southern savannas. Evangeline was not taken far away, only to New England, but without Gabriel all lands were drear, and she set off in the search for him, working here and there, sometimes looking timidly at the headstones on new graves, then traveling on. Once she heard that he was a coureur des bois on the prairies, again that he was a voyager in the Louisiana lowlands, but those of his people who kept near her inclined to jest at her faith and urged her to marry LeBlanc, the notary's son, who truly loved her. To these she only replied, "I cannot." Down the Ohio and Mississippi she went on a raft, with a little band of those who were seeking the French settlements, where the language, religion, and simplicity of life recalled Acadia. They found it on the banks of the Teche, and they reached the house of the herdsman Gabriel on the day that he had departed for the north to seek Evangeline. She and the good priest who had been her stay in a year of sorrow turned back in pursuit, and for weary months, over prairie and through forest, skirting mountain and morass, going freely among savages, they followed vain clues, and at last arrived in Philadelphia. Broken in spirit then, but not less sweet of nature for the suffering that she had known, she who had been named for the angels became a minister of mercy, and in the black robe of a nun went about with comforts to the sick and poor. A pestilence was sweeping through the city, and those who had no friends nor attendants were taken to the almshouse, whither, as her way was, Evangeline went on a soft Sabbath morning to calm the fevered and brighten the hearts of the dying. Some of the patients of the day before had gone and new were in their places. Suddenly she turned white and sank on her knees at a bedside, with a cry of "Gabriel, my beloved," breathed into the ears of a prematurely aged man who lay gasping in death before her. He came out of his stupor, slowly, and tried to speak her name. She drew his head to her bosom, kissed him, and for one moment they were happy. Then the light went out of his eyes and the warmth from his heart. She pressed his eyelids down and bowed her head, for her way was plainer now, and she thanked God that it was so.